Okay, so I want to respond to a video that I saw yesterday by Bearing. It was a good video, actually. It was an interesting subject, a good article that he'd found. Largely because I suppose there's a few points that I want to add to what he'd said, but also because this involves the University of Sydney. This was in the Sydney Morning Herald, which means there's every chance that I can shoehorn my outrageously poor Australian accents in somewhere down the line. I can't let that opportunity go by. Right, I'm going to assume, I think it's probably a fair assumption, to assume that you are not a regular reader, dear viewer, of the Sydney Morning Herald. I'm also going to assume that you've not seen Bearing's video and furnish you with some of the background of what this is about. So this was the headline in the Sydney Morning Herald. Sydney University defends new scholarship that favours men as consistent with diversity. The University of Sydney is standing by a new $27,000 vet science scholarship that favours men after students protested that it constitutes unacceptable sexism, as opposed presumably to acceptable sexism. The scholarship information says that preference will be given to applicants who are from rural or regional areas, male, interested in large animal practice, and an Australian citizen. The one that's raised the red flag there is the male part. Okay, the women's officer at the Student Representative Council at the university, Imogens Response, said female vet students were horrified. And I'm kind of assuming there that Imogen Grant sounds something a little bit like Dame Edna Everage. If she doesn't, I apologise for that, Imogen Grant. What is interesting here, this is something that Bearing didn't pick up upon, but it's an interesting point, is that you can hear there the perspective of the women's officer on the Students' Representative Council. Note there's nothing from the men's officer on the Students' Representative Council, and I'd bet everything that I own that is because there is not a men's officer on the Students' Representative Council. It is indicative of this whole issue, really, of how we view men and women, particularly in education, that there is a women's officer and not a men's officer. Of course, historically, men greatly outnumbered women. Women were a minority. They were heavily underrepresented, and many of the facilities and the systems and structures that existed in universities reflected the fact that women were underrepresented, and so that kind of fixed that in, because things were set up to take account of the fact that most students were male. Okay, so a women's officer made sense, and women do have issues that are particular to women, let's all be honest. So I don't have a problem with having a women's officer, but now we have a situation in universities across the Western world and across the westernised world, such as places like Australia, where female students greatly outnumber male students. Girls are doing better than boys at school, and they're doing better than boys. They're getting more places at university and doing better than men are doing at university. And yet there is still no men's officer. And you can see just how one-sided it makes things such as this, so that when you get something like this, you have somebody like Imogen Grant, and I'm not blaming Imogen Grant, she's the women's officer, for fuck's sake. It is her job to stick up for women who will give that perspective, to try and land grab as much as she can for female students, but there's nobody to counter that. There's nobody that you can go whose job it is to give a biased perspective in favour of men, to put the men's side of the story. And I think that that's something that needs correcting. Let me go on to what Imogen said next, because I think that was quite interesting. Ms. Grant conceded there were women-only and Indigenous-only scholarships offered at university. Here we go. But what distinguishes those scholarships is they are in place to procure benefits for people who face structural barriers to receiving an education. You know, this is something that I could have bought 20 fucking, 30, 40 fucking years ago. I could have bought this. The situation in Australia now, I've checked the stats, I'll show you the stats over here somewhere, is that 60% of those who are getting a first degree in university now in Australia are women. 40% are men. So you've got 3 women getting a first degree for every 2 men that are getting a first degree, and yet she's still maintaining that the people that are facing structural barriers in terms of getting an education across the board are female students. They are girls who are looking to go into higher education. I really find that a little bit of a struggle, and this is a comment that was made by another female student in relation to this. Okay, let me see if I can. I'm gonna have to use a different accent here, aren't I? I just think it shows very little thought into the causative agents of underrepresentation. I sound a little bit like an Australian field mouse here, don't I? Of women in STEM. The barriers that prevent men from entering vet science are not the same barriers that prevent women from entering every single other academic area. Again, I've got to go back to that statistic, which is, how can she say that there are these barriers that are affecting women entering every single other academic area when across the board women are outnumbering men in Australia across all these academic areas 60-40? That's just not holding up to any scrutiny, is it? And this is the interesting thing, right? This is the point that the central point that I wanted to make in this video. This idea that there are somehow different factors at play, and Baring just sort of rightly criticised and said, well, it's very easy. Effectively, it's very easy to make half an argument, isn't it? It's very easy to say, yeah, well, this is different to this. But it's when you've got to make a full argument and you've got to substantiate and flesh that out. That's when it becomes a little bit more complicated. That's when you've actually got to do something. And that's the bit that's missing here. It's easy to say, well, there's different barriers involved without saying what they were. But rather than getting annoyed about that, what I wanted to try and do was to think, and I was thinking about this last night, what those barriers will be in her mind, right? What she's thinking about. And it seems to me that across the board, people who have this kind of mindset, I propose, how they're feeling about this is that effectively, when you have a subject where male students are underrepresented, their perspective is that effectively this is a result of men just choosing, right? Well, men don't want to be vets. Men don't want to be nurses, and that's all there is to it. If they wanted to apply, they could just apply. So any subject where you see men as underrepresented, it's due to their choice. But then the assumption is made that wherever women are underrepresented in a particular course, we will assume that there is some kind of discrimination taking place, or we will assume that this is a result of, we'll view choice in a slightly different way. It's almost as if we're viewing choice in a slightly different way. We're viewing men at the point of entry and saying that they are human beings with free will at the point of entry, and we're judging them at that point. Whereas with women, we take a slightly more holistic approach. And even if at the point of entry they say, well, we don't really want to be engineers, we start tracking back then, don't we? And saying, well, were you encouraged when you were younger to play with Lego? Were you encouraged to consider these as options, right? But the problem with the perspective of people like Imogen Grant and this other student is that they're not doing the same thing when it comes to men. They're not looking back and saying, well, are men encouraged to look at these things like nursing in the same kind of way as women are? No, it's just deemed as if it's an issue of choice when it comes down to men, whereas it's something nefarious when it involves women. And this is the sticking point that I have. The point that irks me with regard to this is that if you cannot, how can you possibly, if you're prepared to accept that when it comes to men, that if they're underrepresented in a subject that is their willed choice, then how can that never be the case when it comes to women? Surely even if there are these other factors with regard to women in some subjects, there must be some subjects out there. There must just be some subjects that women are underrepresented simply because they're not fucking interested in it, right? If it holds true for men in every example when men are underrepresented, then surely in some of the subjects where women are underrepresented, the same logic must hold true. And yet seemingly it's never applied that way. Whenever women are underrepresented, something else is taking place, right? There's something nefarious that we need to deal with. And this reminded me of something. Let me show you something from Norway. And the example with Norway, it's really interesting in Norway. The situation in Norway with regard to universities is even greater than it is, the disparity is even greater than it is in Australia. 63% of students, so we're almost at the 2/3 mark, right? 63% of students who complete the first degree are female students. We're almost back to the bad old days. We're nearly back to the bad old days where 2/3 of students were men, where that was regarded as absolutely unacceptable and sexist, but now it's the other way round and it isn't treated as such a problem. We seem to have a very different perspective on it. And to such a degree that they have a system in Norway, and this is what reminded me of Norway. They have a system in Norway whereby if there is a gender discrepancy, right, in terms of a particular course, you can award 2 extra points, 2 gender points, for applicants of the underrepresented gender to try and boost their chance of their application being successful, to try and normalise things, I suppose, to equalise the application levels and remove those discrepancies as they see it. And in fact, there are 141 courses given out by Norwegian universities where gender points are given to take account of underrepresentation on the grounds of gender. Now, what is interesting when you consider that 63% of students who are doing first degrees in Norwegian universities are female, of those 141 courses that issue a couple of gender points, 139 of them are awarding gender points to female students. So even in a situation where almost 2/3 of university students at the first degree level are female, and where female students are outperforming male students at all levels, it's still 139 out of 141 situations where it is deemed that the underrepresentation has to be dealt with. It's in favour of female students. So seemingly all those other subjects where male students are being underrepresented, it doesn't really matter. It's men just making their choice. That's a really, really odd set of circumstances. Now, Bering got quite hot under the collar about this. He got kind of annoyed about this kind of double standard. I'll be honest, I'm not annoyed about it in the way that Bering's annoyed about it. My perspective on these kinds of things, such as they're talking about in the Sydney Morning Herald, is that I'd rather we didn't see them at all, actually. I don't think that these are a good way to handle things. If you're going to try and deal with discrepancies in university entrance, the time to deal with it is to open children's minds, not when they're applying to university, but 10 years earlier, and not to start cutting opportunities off for them. It's not to try and jerry-rig it at the point of entry. So I don't really like these systems working either way round. It doesn't annoy me, this. But the attitudes of people like Imogen Grant and this other woman depresses me. That's what it does. It depresses me because it's just yet another example of the fact as to why these debates are never going to end. Because seemingly, even when you have a situation as lopsided as we have in further education, where one group is massively outperforming the other, and the group that is massively outperforming the other is getting almost every single benefit that is available, and is the one that the politicians are interested in, and is the one that society is interested in, that even then, all it takes is for one thing to be done in favour of the other group, and people will be outraged by it. People will regard it as unacceptable. What hope is there? Because this isn't just this isn't just saying this is what them bitches are like, always complaining, right? Men are as bad. Everybody is as bad when it comes to this kind of thing, I'm afraid. What hope is there looking forward of ever ending these kinds of fucking annoying discussions that we have to have with regard to gender and equality, when a situation can be as lopsided as that, and people still regard themselves as getting the shitty end of the stick when everything seems to be stacked in their favour? Okay, thanks for watching. Bye for now.